Formula One's new era got underway at the Bahrain Grand Prix, and it was the first opportunity to see what the teams have really got with their new machines. And the first team to really show what they'd got and show that they'd got the best machine was Ferrari. The F1TV was the class of the field in the first round of the season. But interestingly, Ferrari turned up at that race with no major updates on the car. However, coming into the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, where essentially they took the same approach, there was one major change on the car. It was the rear wing. Now, a lot of teams have introduced low drag specification rear wings for Saudi Arabia. That's due to the high-speed nature of the Jeddah Corniche circuit. And you will see a lot of teams up and down the grid trying out different rear wings. Some of them even tried out two different specifications. Mercedes is one of those teams trying out different specifications of rear wing in Saudi Arabia. But before we take a look at what the world champions have done to the rear wing of their car for the second round, I got a chance to take a slightly deeper look at what they had done to the car in the first round. The team had revised its front wing slightly and had a couple of options of upper flap on the wing. And that just gave them the option to shift the aero balance around by about 2%. More fundamental, but far more subtle to see, was the underside of the nose had a slightly larger cutout in it. It was a bit more sculpted, and Mercedes feel that that allowed them to control the airflow to the leading edge of the floor slightly better. But that's not the only thing that the team that were clearly struggling for pace at some points of the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend had to do. Looking around the rear floor of the car, Mercedes had revised the shape of the floor ever so slightly and added one of these metal stays. Now, the team say this is to help with preventing porpoising, but I think it's just to allow the team to run a slightly lighter rear floor section, and that stay means that they'll be able to do that. Moving forward again into the present and Saudi Arabia, there's some interesting stuff to look at on the rear wing of the car. Now, this is the rear wing that Mercedes used in Bahrain. That's their highest downforce specification rear wing. They brought that along because, well, quite simply, they needed the downforce. And when you take a look at the shape of it, it's pretty distinctive. Well, coming into Saudi Arabia, the team felt that they were losing out a bit too much pace on the straight lines. And on a circuit like Jeddah Corniche, you need that straight line speed. So what did Mercedes do to the wing? Well, it's pretty dramatic, isn't it? Huge scalloping out of the upper section, and it looked like it was progressively getting flatter and flatter as the free practice sessions went on. So pretty drastic changes there down at Mercedes. They also played around with the front wing as well to try and balance that car out, but still a lot of work to do for the world champions. Red Bull are another one of those teams that brought a couple of different specifications of rear wing to Saudi Arabia. But before we get into what they're doing in Saudi Arabia, I got a chance to take a closer look at the car in the garage in Bahrain.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how this car has changed since we first saw it?
Very little, you'd be surprised actually. The front wing is unchanged. The side pod detail, it got pulled in a little bit more under the Oracle logo. Top of the floor is the same, minor changes underneath. Rear wing is a lower level than we generally tested. Otherwise, it's the same car we had in Barcelona, the same car it was in Bahrain.
Now, you mentioned the side pods changed ever so slightly. What's the objective of making those changes?
Ultimately, everything we do is aimed at the currency of lap time. So we are looking for just more performance out of the car. So if we push and pull this surface around, it's because we think we can extract more lap time from it. So we're looking for either reduction in drag, an increase in the downforce, or both of those in combination.
Now, you mentioned the changes of drag and downforce, and you did mention that this is not the sort of rear wing where you'd normally go for around here. So tell me a bit about what the choice you've made for the rear wing.
Well, with the shape changes we've got for this year, your challenges from the previous years are always the same, is to find the wing level that gives you the best compromise for qualifying, the best compromise for the race. So qualifying, you look for a little bit more downforce, the race you typically look for a little bit less, you're still striking that compromise, we've got DRS. So our choice is a shame, the shape is quite different because of the end plate detail into the main plane. So there you are, that's the trade you were effectively asking about.
Now, it's fair to say that Red Bull's Bahrain Grand Prix didn't exactly go to plan. The car did look pretty quick right throughout the race, only beaten really by the Ferraris. However, late in the race, a fuel system issue saw both cars retire, and there's been a little bit of specification over what that issue really was. Now, the team initially thought it was something on the fuel pump. They later discovered that there was a vacuum in the fuel lines. This led to quite a few people speculating that the car had simply run out of petrol. I don't think that was really the case. There was a safety car earlier in the race, which meant both of the Red Bulls would have been able to save a bit of fuel, so the tanks shouldn't have been empty. On top of that, as Aston Martin learned to their extreme cost at the Hungarian Grand Prix last year, even if there is some fuel left in the tank, you need to have about half of a litre in there for the FIA to go and check it, because if that fuel tank is completely dry, you will just get disqualified from the race. So I think there was fuel in both of the Red Bull tanks, but the problem, I think, was a little bit more complicated. I don't recall Red Bull Racing running a fuel run-out test in either Barcelona or Bahrain pre-season. That's a test that most teams run at the start of the season just to see what happens when the car does run out of fuel. And I fear that what may have happened with Red Bull is the fuel started to cavitate. So the cavitation is just where all the fuel starts to bubble up, and the fuel pump was just drawing in a little bit of fuel, but mostly air, creates a vacuum in the fuel line, and the engine can't run on thin air. The technology hasn't moved on that far, and that means Red Bulls were both out of the race. However, coming in to Saudi Arabia, Red Bull believe they fixed that issue. Haven't said why or how, because Red Bull are a little bit cagey about these things. But the first big change we have seen on the Red Bull, or haven't really seen in great detail, is here around the front brake ducts. Now, the front brake ducts look pretty similar to the specification they used in Bahrain. However, Red Bull has said, in order to improve reliability, and that's quite an interesting phrase for the front brakes, they've changed the internal ducting around the front brake disc, the caliper, and of course the upright. There are some aerodynamic gains to be made in that area as well. So be interested to see if Red Bull have gone that way on top of that. But moving on further to the rear of the car, Red Bull turned up in Saudi Arabia with some different specifications of lower beam wing to experiment with, so they can just trim out the car to suit this high-speed circuit with this very new generation of car. They hadn't confirmed which version they were going to go with going into the weekend. We'll see what they turn up with when the car goes into the race and into qualifying. Moving on to McLaren. That's a team that turned up with absolutely nothing new on the car for Saudi Arabia. However, they did turn up with a whole bunch of new parts on the car in Bahrain. And James Key showed me all of those details in the garage.
I mean, I think like most teams, we've done some updates for the first race. You know, these regulations are still very fresh. There's still lots to find. I think one thing we rushed through real quick was these front brake ducts. You can only just see the inlets there, but the inlets are very big compared to what we'd like. We had issues during the test, and we needed to act quickly to try and, first of all, understand those issues, but then design something and manufacture something within a space of days to try and improve things. So it's not just that duct. Everything under the skin has changed as well. I'm glad to say it's run okay so far. So that was one of the steps we made. Other areas, if we walk around, there's little bits and pieces on front wing, but the floor in particular was new. So this area on the side of the floor was all updated for this event. We ran that in the Bahrain test last week, and it seemed to do its job. Little devices like the things on the top of the side pods there, as well as little fins at the top. They were also new for race one. And then towards the back of the car, lots of noisy race cars outside. And towards the back, we made a few little bits and pieces on some of the fairings and that sort of thing here. There was only minor tweaks really at the back of the car that we had the time to do. But there's plenty of potential here, and we're looking to update that further in the next races. But obviously the floor is the most important thing on these cars with ground effect, and that's the area that we concentrated on most.
Now, you mentioned the floor is important for ground effect. We've seen this fairly significant upgrade you bought earlier in the week. Could you tell me what you're trying to achieve with these details on the floor edge?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, what you can't see underneath, and that's sort of, in many respects, the secret bit that everyone tries to protect. But you've basically got a huge amount of downforce being generated by the floor. You've got an inlet with these fences in it, these kind of fins that you can see, the big vortex-generating devices. You've got tunnels that go out the back, and the way you treat your floor edge, you've basically got a sort of an outwashing condition at the front, which means flow is coming outboard. But with such a massive, powerful diffuser as we have now, you've got an enormous amount of suction at the back. Again, the ground proximity really making that pull really hard on the air. And so you have inwash. And so you've got various devices at the side of the floor, and indeed in the underside where you can't see, which are trying to make best use of that outwash, inwash, and of course the flow underneath.
Alpine, that's another team that had a few struggles in Bahrain. They bought new side pods on both of their cars, but on one of the cars, that of Esteban Ocon, the side pod, well, it fell off and got broken. They didn't have any spares, so he had to run the old specification through that Grand Prix. Well, for Saudi Arabia, both Fernando Alonso and Esteban Ocon are running with the new side pods. That's not the only thing that's new on that car though. The team have bought a brand new floor to Saudi Arabia, but curiously it didn't appear on the FIA's official list of new parts. And this is the new floor, you can see it here. It's a very different shaped cutout with almost a spike on the side of the floor. Dread to think what that's going to do to the sidewall of a tyre in a close battle, but we'll find out. Well, that floor didn't appear on the car in free practice. The team went to scrutineering with it, but it's yet to see the light of day on track. So I wonder if we are going to see it in use later in the season. But that is a pretty dramatic change, as Alpine, like many teams, are trying to control the flow along the edge of the floor and just try to seal the edge of that floor and get a whole load more downforce. AlphaTauri is an interesting case. The team has been bringing some updates, but not bringing them to the race events. We saw quite a lot of updates in testing, but not all of them have made it to the car in the race. But coming into Saudi Arabia, the team turned up with a revised set of cooling louvers on the side panel of the car. Now, I only saw this when we were putting this package together, but you can just see it here with the little details, just a little half set of louvers. And this is a removable panel on the edge of the car. Well, that's something that AlphaTauri hadn't experimented with in testing, but it turned up in Saudi Arabia. The version of cooling they used in testing, which I expected to see at this race for hotter conditions, you can see here in a photo I took in the pit lane. You can see the much more opened up louvers than we saw on the car that came out of the pits there. But also you can see this spine cooler here. That's something that Haas have been using, and a number of teams, Alpine as well, have been experimenting with. That's an interesting detail that I can't quite understand why AlphaTauri are not using on track here in Saudi Arabia. Aston Martin, another troubled team going into the 2022 season. The car does seem to be lacking a little bit of performance and a little bit of pace. But to take a closer look at some of the developments going into the opening race of the year, I was joined by Andy Green.
You've got a number of updates that you've brought to the car for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Can you tell us at first what those updates are?
Yeah, we did bring a few. Obviously, we were testing quite heavily the previous week, so we brought a lot of updates to the previous test. So for this event, relatively small amount of updates in comparison to what we did last week. We did try a few development parts yesterday in free practice, but those have gone back on the shelf, and we'll try those again in the next event, or a modified version of those anyway. But for this event, yeah, like I say, relatively small. Some minor changes for reliability purposes, which are invisible to what we can see here. But around the car, some small changes. If we look here on the front of the floor, there's a new floor for this event, and it had a shorter leading strake, which cleaned up the airflow into the floor, which was a small improvement. We did some small changes to the mirrors as well, slightly less drag, a little bit more downforce. Again, some small changes to the halo flick as well. These are all relatively small, but it's a time where you add a few small bits together and you get a small gain. So these were that was the main area of concentration, I think, that you can see for updates relative to where we finished the last tests. So.
Now, I read on the documentation you sent over to us, you've changed the leading edge of the side pod as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done there?
So there was a small change we identified just at the bottom here on the side pod. You can see the area that's been modified, this patch that's been put on here. That was a relatively small change. It's something an area that we wanted to address. And while the cars are away from the factory, it's not something we wanted to wait until the cars get back, because we're on a back-to-back with the next event. So we decided to do it in the field and just make the small modification there. It's relatively small, but like I say, it's the small things that all add up.
Well, one of those changes that Andy Green was showing me in the garage down at Aston Martin was immediately removed for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Take a look around here on the rear of that halo. That sticky outy bit that he was showing me, well, that's been removed immediately for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. That's all to do with drag reduction, and that's something to do with the Jeddah Corniche circuit rather than the car specifically. Aston Martin and another one of these teams to run the low drag rear wing as well. However, there are some more fundamental changes around the rear of the car that are worth pointing out. If you look down here, just at the back ahead of the rear wheel, Aston Martin has introduced one of these floor stays that the teams have now been allowed to use. In theory, that's to help reduce porpoising, stop the rear of the floor from flexing. However, that will also allow the team to run a slightly lighter carbon fibre material at the rear of the floor, so that should help them out as well in terms of weight. So another one of these little changes that a lot of the teams are making for this race season. Curiously, coming into the Saudi Arabian weekend, every single team has to declare all of their new parts, and Williams announced that it was going to be running at least one of its cars with an asymmetric cooling layout, in that it's got different cooling ducting side to side of the car. We've seen this many times before. I remember back in 2008, McLaren used to run a very different rear layout of their car, which we even got as far as naming the Quasimodo McLaren because it was so dramatic. Well, nothing so dramatic on the Williams FW44, but as you can see on the screen here, you can see a couple of the different options. Now, the picture on the left closest to me is the photo I took in testing, and you can just see a single cooling slot opened, but you can see the range of ducts available on that slot. And then on the right, this is the layout that the team are running in Saudi Arabia. Well, there's a huge suite of different parts and panels that Williams can add in there, but there is a little bit of a kicker in some of the Williams panels designs. Some of these little louvres, when they open up the full set of louvres, they're not actually open. There's just little solid bits of carbon fibre. So I think they're doing something quite interesting underneath the bodywork with this car that we haven't fully understood or seen quite yet. In Bahrain, Alfa Romeo modified the front brake ducts. Well, in Saudi Arabia, they modified the rear brake ducts, and you can see a little bit of that around the back end of the car. What the team are trying to do there is nothing to do with brake cooling. They're not in the same situation that McLaren are, in that they're overheating their brakes. What they're actually trying to do is actually just boost the downforce of the rear end of the car. And in order to change those rear brake ducts, they've also changed the shrouding around the rear suspension. Pretty dramatic change, but of course this season Alfa Romeo is manufacturing its own transmission for the first time in a long time, moving away from that Ferrari gearbox, giving them the freedom to make those changes.